everyone. My name is Zolani Maola. I am the one who sings. And I'm really, really honored to be here today with you at the FNF Africa Freedom Prize ceremony. It is my delight to share with you my latest work, Remember Who You Are. Now, the song is particularly for you, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, for your tremendous, outstanding work, because you truly do remind us to remember who we are.
If the birds up in the trees know how beautiful they are, if the mountains and the seas know how magical they are, if the stars which made our skin show how radiant they are, won't they shine their light until you remember who you are? Yes, you are, yes, you are. You're the dreamer awaking. Yes, you are, yes, you are. You're a part of everything. Yes, you are, yes, you are. We will shine these words until you remember who you are. Oh, remember who you are. You thought you were broken. Oh, remember who you are. You thought yourself ugly. Oh, remember who you are. And you tried to bury you. Oh, remember who you are.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the FNF Africa Freedom Prize Ceremony 2020. My name is Friedrich Naumann. I'm a broadcast journalist, producer, author, and news anchor in Johannesburg, South Africa. It is my absolute honor and privilege to be your host today. Now, I'm thrilled to be part of what promises to be a very memorable event. Every year, the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom honors outstanding personalities of the African continent with its African Freedom Prize. Now, the Freedom Prize 2020 will be awarded to none other than Ms. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. The FNF Africa Freedom Prize is an annual award for outstanding personalities in sub-Saharan Africa, individuals who are particularly committed to freedom-related topics and issues such as democracy, freedom of the press, and human rights. And these individuals are also global role models. We are well aware that it can be so uncomfortable to stand up for such values and ideals and to openly criticize, especially those who are powerful in our societies. The personalities FNF honors do not just receive praise and accolades for their work. On the contrary, their voices are often suppressed and their positions are criticized. However, FNF would like to honor those who continue to devote themselves to such issues despite any headwinds. The approaches of their prize winners encourage people to reflect and think social norms and values. The FNF is convinced that a free, dynamic, and innovative Africa will enable people to live a self-determined life. The Friedrich-Naumann Foundation is a German foundation for liberal politics with headquarters in Berlin and Potsdam and worldwide offices and projects. It's a pleasure to introduce to you the Regional Director for Sub-Saharan Africa for FNF, Ms. Inga Herbert.
Dear Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, dear Lady Tlabi, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Africa Freedom Prize celebration. In Sub-Saharan Africa, the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom has offices in Johannesburg, Cape Town, Harare, Abidjan, Dakar, and Dar es Salaam. We also organize regional activities uniting and connecting people on the whole continent. We work with partners, organizations, and individual change makers in the fields of capacity building, human rights, poverty reduction, and liberal democracy reforms. 2020 has been a very difficult year, full of uncertainty, worldwide and also in sub-Saharan Africa. Apart from human suffering and death, we have also seen massive restriction of civil rights. In many African countries, regimes headed by old men have used the pretext of the pandemic to pursue opponents, journalists, and also people who simply raise their voices. With the Sub-Saharan Africa Freedom Prize, the regional office of the FNF is honoring outstanding African personalities who provide decisive impulses for the development of open and free societies in African countries. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, you are the laureate of the Africa Freedom Prize 2020. It is time to celebrate. Today we celebrate you. You represent a new generation of African women who are proudly African, independent, and successful. You are one of the most influential contemporary writers. And you are so much more. You continuously raise your voice for freedom and self-determination of women and for a more just and more complex image of Africa. Ms. Adichie, you stand for freedom from the one-dimensional image of crisis, poverty, and dependence of African countries. You stand for freedom from patriarchism and corruption, and you stand for freedom from patronage and prejudice. We are excited to celebrate the Africa Freedom Prize 2020 today with you as our laureate.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Inga Herbert. Thanks indeed, the Sub-Saharan Africa Regional Director for FNF. So, Ms. Adichie is a Nigerian international author who now lives partly in Nigeria and partly in the United States, and she writes in English. In her novels, speeches, and books, she addresses social issues with honesty and eloquence. Her work has received many international awards and is considered an outstanding example of young African literature. Her work has been translated into over 30 languages and has appeared in various publications, including The New Yorker, Granta, the O'Hare Prize Stories, the Financial Times, and Zoetrope. She's the author of many novels. Purple Hibiscus, which won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize and the Hurston Wright Legacy Award. Half of a Yellow Sun, which won the Orange Prize and was a National Book Critics Circle Award finalist and a New York Times notable book. And Americana, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award and was named one of the New York Times top 10 best books of 2013. Ms. Adichie is also the author of the story collection, The Thing Around Your Neck. Ms. Adichie has been invited to speak around the world. Many of us are familiar with her TED Talks. 2009 TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, is now one of the most viewed TED Talks of all times. Her 2012 talk, We Should All Be Feminists, has triggered a worldwide debate about feminism and was published in a book in 2014. And I've been particularly excited visiting South African universities and hearing young women in particular quoting that particular talk. In her speeches and writings, she takes a clear stand and criticizes, in particular, issues like corruption and autocratic governments, feminism and identity. She writes about colonialism in Africa, Pan-Africanism, and homosexuality, the whole spectrum of identity, really. We all want to express our respect for your work and your unbroken commitment to strengthen women's rights and to put a spotlight, really, on the kind of outstanding African personalities such as you, Ms. Adichie. You are a true role model, and congratulations on this particular award. We can't wait to hear your words. Over to you.
So thank you, Inga. Thank you, Ridi. I have titled my speech today, What If We Raised the Bar for Men? Some thoughts on the epidemic of women all over the world being beaten and killed by men. Now, it is not a very elegant title. It's not concise, but it is deliberate, because it seems to me that language matters very much. Language can shield the true reality of things. Language can desensitize us. Language can lose its ability to capture very specific realities. I could have titled my speech, Thoughts on Gender-Based Violence, or GBV. It even has a kind of cool ring to it. It slips out of the mouth very easily, GBV. But why have I chosen not to do so? Because while I acknowledge that the expression GBV is perhaps useful in certain spaces, it does not quite capture the inhumane, immoral, and utterly unacceptable phenomenon that I think deserves maximum attention, which is that all over the world today, so many women are beaten, raped, and murdered by men, and that these women would not suffer this kind of violence if they were not women. Yes, men suffer violence, but it is overwhelmingly women who suffer violence based on their gender. And more importantly, in the language we use to talk about it, it sometimes makes the violence a kind of neutral phenomenon, as though it is something that falls from the sky, as though it is something that is inevitable, when we know very well that it is in fact the result of choices made by men. We say gender-based violence, but violence by whom? Yes, there are cases where women attack women and men attack men, but we must be forthright in addressing this ugly epidemic that it is overwhelmingly women who suffer violence from men. So here's a United Nations statistics. 137 women are killed by a member of their family every day. What it doesn't say is that it is nearly always a male family member. There are rape statistics that show anything from 30% to 70% of women who have experienced some form of sexual violence in different countries all over the world. But we know the statistics are wrong. We know the numbers are higher. because we know there is still so much stigma attached to rape that so many women do not talk about it. I have a friend who works for a corporate organization here in Lagos, and she told me a story about asking the women in her company what they wanted their guest speakers to talk about. So when she asked the women to attach their names to their topic suggestions, she got generic, vague topics like the life-work balance. But when she asked the women to send their topics anonymously, she was startled that the topic that was overwhelmingly sent in by the women was domestic violence. It is no longer enough to criticize. It is time to imagine alternatives. It is time to think about possibilities. There is a lot of focus on women who are the victims of reducing a crime without focusing on the perpetrators of the crime. And so, what if we raise the bar for men? There is an epidemic of male entitlement to female bodies. The way society controls female bodies makes men unconsciously believe that a woman's body does not belong to her. In many societies on this continent, it starts with female circumcision. Now, one of the wonderful things about the female body is that the clitoris has no other function but female pleasure. So when you take a girl and you forcefully and violently cut off her clitoris, what is the point? When you forcefully sew up a girl's vagina, making her vulnerable to horrible pain and infections and lifelong discomfort, what is the point of this torture? The point is control. The point is to control a woman sexually. It is to deny a woman sexual agency, and it is to tell her that her body does not belong to her. Now, male circumcision, when it happens, is about initiation into manhood. It is often uncomfortable, and in my opinion, it is unnecessary, but it is not about controlling male sexuality or male bodies. It is not about shame. But female circumcision is a barbaric process that aims specifically to diminish women and control them. At least 200 million women and girls have undergone circumcision, which is also called female genital mutilation. But the reason I choose to call it circumcision is that it's a language that's often used in the countries where it's practiced. And I think it's important for us to use the language that is used in the communities that practice them. And so of these 200 million women and girls in 31 countries, half of those countries are in West Africa. We cannot accept a culture where women are considered second-class citizens and then turn around and be surprised that women are raped and beaten by men. The two are connected. If you do not give value to a thing, then it is easy to abuse that thing. So recently, a woman got married in my hometown, and a man said to her, in giving words of advice for a happy marriage, he said to her, "Everything you do from now on, you must remember that you are now under a man." And I remember thinking, he could have told her, "You're now in a loving partnership. You'll be making joint decisions instead of solo decisions. You now have a friend to walk with you on life's path, and you will have good times and bad times." But no, he told her, "You are now under a man." This language matters. If a woman is under a man, then it is easy to justify violence against her. If she is under a man, then she does not have autonomy over her own life. Now, this man who said that a woman was under a man because she was married told me, "It is our culture." Okay, if it is our culture, then it is time to change it. Culture changes all the time. In my hometown in eastern Nigeria, I know the first set of twins who survived the practice of killing twins. In 1940, if a woman gave birth to twins in some parts of Igbo land, the babies would be swiftly taken from her and left in a forest to die, because Igbo cosmology believed that twins were evil. Now, I can imagine many people, both men and women at the time, saying, "It is our culture." And it was, but it changed. And today, I don't think any Igbo person would support the killing of twins. Culture does not make people. People make culture. We can make and remake culture. It is strange to live in a modern world, a world of cell phones and airplanes, and insist on selectively holding on to parts of culture that existed in pre-modern times and that reduce the human worth and potential of women. Biology is the basis of male oppression of women. Men in general are physically stronger than women, and this has been the basis of male oppression of women. Our human history was one where might ruled, and so men ruled, and men made rules that benefited them, and they call those rules culture. We live in different times. We live in a time where might no longer rules. It is not necessarily the strongest person who gets to rule, and so we must remake the rules to benefit everyone. How do we do this? By changing mindsets. We can pass all the laws we want to, but if we do not change the mindsets of people, if we do not change how we think about things, nothing changes. And so this is how to change a mindset. Talk about it. Create stories. Create transparency until one day that thing becomes ordinary. That thing becomes normal. So there's an example I like to use of the show in the US called Will and Grace. Will and Grace was a show that showed gay people as ordinary and normal. And it did so much to combat homophobia in the United States, much more than any laws could have done. And so a question that I think is important to ask is, how do boys learn about sex? What do boys learn about sex? Many African cultures teach boys that the way to go about getting sex is through coercion, through deception, and sometimes through force. And it teaches girls that they can never admit to wanting sex because it means they are immoral and unworthy of marriage. Marriage, of course, being the ultimate prize for a woman. And I hope that the sarcasm with which I said that was not lost on anyone. What this results in is that both men and women have a hypocritical, distorted attitude to sex, and for women, this attitude is dangerous because it can lead to rape and murder. It is true that rape is about power and not about desire, but that this need for power and control manifests itself through sex speaks to the assumptions our cultures hold about sex. Rape is in some ways an extreme example of what our culture teaches about sex. Is there anywhere in our mainstream culture that female consent is celebrated, that female pleasure is celebrated, that female sexual agency is celebrated? A married woman in most parts of Africa today is seen as property, because she will be told by her family and by her religious leaders that she must always submit to her husband. She must have sex with him even if she doesn't want to, which is a way of validating rape. What if we do better with sex education? What if we have open, honest, and uncomfortable conversations about sex? And the plainer the language, the better. What if sex education were not limited to biology? What if we didn't teach young people just about the egg and the sperm cell, but also about the society we live in, about social norms and about cultural assumptions, such as the cultural assumption around women and their bodies? Now, I think shame can be a useful thing. We should teach girls that they should be ashamed of themselves when they are dishonest and when they tell lies and when they steal. But they should never feel shame about their bodies. Biology is too often a source of shame for women, and biology should never be a source of shame. I remember growing up and being made to feel ashamed when I got my period. If your dress accidentally got stained, you felt terrible shame, as though periods were not natural things, as though somehow you had done something wrong. Periods happen specifically to girls, and to make it a shameful thing is to teach girls that something is wrong with their bodies. periods should just be ordinary. They should be seen as normal as the sun shining and the rain falling and people sweating. But the shame does not stop with periods. We do not give girls the language to talk about their bodies. I know so many adult women today who know little about their bodies and who are ashamed of their bodies and who cannot talk about their bodies. The word for vagina in my language, Igbo, is considered very vulgar. So imagine this scenario. A little girl, innocent, helpless, is being sexually abused by her uncle. She's scared and confused. Sexual assault is difficult enough to talk about, even for an adult. But how will this little child talk about it when she doesn't even have the language? What will she say? How will she say it? We should give girls the language to be able to talk about their bodies, and most importantly, we must strip that language of shame. And what about men and shame? We know from research, and I think most of us also know this anecdotally, that a baby boy and a baby girl are treated differently from the minute they are born. In fact, even before they are born, it is overwhelmingly female pregnancies that are terminated, specifically because they're female. And studies show us that as infants across cultures all over the world, girls get more hugs and more comforting, while boys are expected to cry less and are comforted less. As toddlers, we already expect boys to be tough and to suck it up and not to cry. So we start very early in our project of constructing the hard cage of masculinity. The problem is not that masculinity itself is bad. That is, masculinity being the idea of having certain expectations for men. The problem is what we have decided that masculinity must look like. We can make a choice as a society to do it differently. We can remake masculinity, and it starts with what we teach boys to be ashamed of. Our culture currently teaches men to be ashamed of weakness, to be ashamed of failure, to be ashamed of not being financial providers. What if we begin to teach little boys to be ashamed of different things? What if we construct a new masculinity? What if from childhood we tell boys that real men do not start fights? But if you bring a fight to him and you're his equal, he will beat you the hell up. What if we tell them that real men cry, that real men talk about emotions, that real men are honest and keep their word? And I am not talking about teaching them about chivalry, because chivalry's premise is female weakness. There are men today, grown men, who want to learn because nobody taught them these things. This is not to excuse men, but instead to challenge what seems to me a kind of inevitability that hangs over the way we talk about male violence against women. It doesn't have to be like this. It doesn't have to be the raging epidemic that it is. What if male cultural role models spoke about this, sang about this, celebrated this new masculinity? The way to change minds is through stories. Cultural products, art, storytelling, music, all have the power to change mindsets. Changing our mindsets will have an effect on how laws are implemented. Today, in many African countries, authorities still do not take sexual violence against women very seriously. I cannot think of how many women in this country, Nigeria, who have been told by the police when they go to report violence done to them by husbands or other male relatives, go home and settle. We need to raise boys and teach them that many of the skills we presently consider female skills are actually human skills. We must expect more from men. It is soft bigotry to have such low expectations of men. When we say that men rape because men will be men, or because a woman wore a short skirt, or because a woman wore a low-cut blouse, then we're saying that men are really wild animals who have no control over themselves. And if it is true, then we cannot trust men in any position of power because they are so lacking in basic self-control. But we know that this is not true. Men are not wild animals who do not have control over themselves. Rape is not about how women dress, because women in countries where women are covered from head to toe are still raped by men. Baby girls are raped by men. Elderly women are raped by men. Men rape because men make the choice to rape. Men can do better, and we as a society must expect men to do better. And so when we say GBV, let us also be specific about which violence is currently an epidemic in the world today. It is male violence against women. We should talk honestly and openly about it. We should change mindsets about it. We should implement laws that severely punish it, and we should raise the bar for men. Thank you, and over to you, Reedy.
Thank you so much for addressing an issue in your keynote that is very close to my heart, Chimamanda, as a South African woman who lives in a country with the highest rape incident in the world. We have 4 times the global femicide average in South Africa, and violence against women has shaped much of my work as a journalist here. I was listening to you offering some tools that we can use to reverse the status quo. And some of the obvious ones to me are about investing in girls' and women's education, giving women economic freedom, having dialogue with men, teaching men how to be different and raise the bar. But it sounds to me that the cultural issues offer the biggest challenge as we strive for equality between men and women. What are your thoughts around how we, as peoples of the world, get around cultural and religious barriers? Not just in Africa, by the way, but in the United States, we are seeing a manifestation of toxic masculinity in politics and everyday life as well. So the question is exactly that, the cultural barriers towards creating the world that you so eloquently described. What are your thoughts there?
I do think it's probably the most difficult. I mean, like you said, economics is important. Women need to have better access. And we still live in a world in which men support men. So wealth creation still is very male. But you know, there are many situations where women who have the good fortune of having a level of economic success and economic power still bend to certain cultural assumptions that are bad for women. So a friend was telling me recently about a young woman who got married and shortly after her marriage got into Harvard and was about to go off for 18 months to do her course in Harvard. And her older relatives, women, were all shocked and saying to her, but what about your husband? How can you leave him and go to Harvard for 18 months? And I remember, and I just found that so strange because these are educated women who know the value of education. And somehow, because this woman is going to go away just for a year and a half, it's somehow the most important thing is, what about your husband, right? Because marriage is the thing that you're supposed to value more than anything else. So I think it's forcing conversations to happen. I think it will take time. I do think it's important to make it cool, by which I mean that there's a lot of sort of cultural power in the idea of what's cool. So I think that if musicians that young people look up to, if actors that young people look up to, start to talk about this and talk about it in ways that are honest, not just lip service, not just saying things like on International Women's Day, saying yes, women's equality, but actually talking about it and also producing work that reflects it. Because you can't talk about how you're for women, but then your music is consistently denigrating women, then it doesn't make sense. So I feel as though I think it's a complex thing that doesn't have easy answers, but I really think that that's the way that we're going to achieve any real change.
I smiled earlier in the introduction when the conversation was around African governments headed by old men who have used the pandemic to really cement their oppression of journalists, of women. And it was ironic because Donald Trump's face flashed in front of me, because that's where it has happened, using the pandemic to slam down on internationalism, on immigration, on women, the Breonna Taylor matter, Black Lives Matter protesters. So even there in the Western world, and we ought to be honest about this, these symbols of oppressions abound and they are tangible. So my question to you is, does it matter who's in leadership today? And are you inspired by any of the leaders that we have in the world today?
Are there any leaders that I am inspired by? That's a very hard question. Actually, yes. Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, I find very inspiring. And I do, because I think she's just demonstrated what leadership can be, where you communicate with the people you're leading, where you put their needs first, where you're thinking in practical ways, and where it's not about your ego. And now, I'm not sure how much of that has to do with her female socialization, but I find her inspiring. I also quite admire Angela Merkel. Well, she's sort of really steady and sort of unflappable and also quite efficient, I think, in that very German way. I think that's maybe it. I admired Barack Obama when he was president. And in terms of just talking about gender, I think that he was a leader who seemed to understand how important it was to talk about the ways in which being born a female person in the world automatically limits you. And it's not just about Africa. I mean, I think that sexism exists everywhere in the world. The difference is that in Western countries, people like to pretend that it's not there, and it's not as overt, it's not as in your face as it is in places like our continent, Africa, and in Latin America, and in some parts of Asia.
My next question to you, it would not make any sense to have this conversation and not ask about end SARS now back in your country. I think a lot of us amplified our voices in solidarity, but there's a way in which leadership was just brazen and not listening, and there's a way in which African governments themselves were not expressing anything, not in any forceful or meaningful way. What can you tell us about your role as a writer? You've said before that you didn't choose writing, writing chose you. There are many ways to be an activist. You can go out into the street and protest against police brutality, but I still believe that the pen is mightier than the sword. I'd love to get into your heart and your thoughts around Nigeria and SARS now, and what you see as your role as writer and teacher.
I take my position as a person who is from Nigeria and who has a platform that is international. And I happen to just have this good fortune of writing books that people read all over the world. And so it's giving me a platform, and I feel a sense of responsibility to use that platform when it comes to issues that are important. And NSAS in this country I found both inspiring and utterly depressing. Inspiring because young people have just had enough. And the idea that they rose up, and I felt it was just so organic across the country, people saying we've had enough, not just of police violence, because I think it really became about wanting more, wanting better. And I found it depressing because we just have a government that, I don't know whether it's that it's unable or unwilling to even just engage with the citizens. And there's something also for me that was very disappointing about the indifference of other African countries. Yes, we all expect the West to speak up, right? So the US and Canada and France and Germany, and they're all saying this is bad. But of course, one is thinking, well, what about our brothers and sisters? And I think it's because we still live in a continent where governments are so terrified of the idea of citizens rising up. And so I imagine that African governments are worried about showing any kind of support for real democratic reforms because they're worried about what's going to happen in their own countries. And so, of course, it speaks to terrible governance across the continent. Our neighbor Cameroon, the people are still being murdered in the sort of Anglophone crisis there. So it's not surprising that Cameroon, for example, would be silent when the Nigerian police, the Nigerian army decides to open fire on innocent people. But I think that there's a lesson here, and the lesson is that increasingly, I think young Africans are no longer willing to accept poor leadership.
Now, here you are receiving the Africa Freedom Prize from the FNF, and you've won so many awards. I wonder what meaning these have for you beyond, obviously, validation and gratification that your work is being appreciated. I ask this because often when we have a star coming out of South Africa, coming out of Zimbabwe, we feel a sense of ownership as Africans that you're putting the continent on the map. It's perhaps a very unfair burden to place on individuals. But in the context of global politics and identity and multiculturalism, what does it mean when someone like you wins an international award like this beyond just appreciation for your work?
Well, it also means that I'm just terrified because I don't know what's then expected of me. No, I think it means, I hope it means something bigger than me. I hope it means that it's a recognition of what can come from Africa and a recognition of what Africa can produce. Because while I am a person who considers herself comfortable in the world, I am deeply and unchangeably a product of my country and of my culture. I wouldn't be here if I hadn't been raised by Igbo parents in a university town in southeastern Nigeria. So I'm a product, really, of Nigeria. And I think that to be recognized often for me is what I hope will happen is that there are young girls and boys across this continent who will look at me and think about what they too can do. That despite, because I think that this is the truth about this continent, that people can thrive in spite of all of the obstacles that our governments place in front of us.
Obviously, when we engage with words, with literature, we all interpret it whichever way it works for us. I just want to go back to your talk on beware of a single story. And that, for me, will speak to xenophobia, certain perceptions that people will have about the other, certain perceptions men will have about what a woman is in society, certain perceptions that white people can have about black people, and so on. It's quite ironic that as much as we know all these things theoretically, in practice, the retreat to nationalism, the retreat to what is familiar, and I can use Brexit as an example, that in times of crisis and socioeconomic challenges that we are facing, people retreat to their own, whatever that is. And now that takes me then to the post-pandemic world. Our economies are going to take a long time to heal. Unemployment is at record lows in many countries. So my fear with all of this is that perhaps the single story, the view about the other and who's responsible for our misery, whatever that is, that the world has that risk of embracing a single story and the safest story at that. What would you say if that were happening, or if that were to happen?
It's interesting that you asked that question because I actually have the same fear. And just observing the world in the past few years and this kind of shift to a kind of right-wing populism across Europe and of course in the US with Trump, and how this populism often sort of uses the language of tribalism. I mean, I think human beings really are tribal. I think we are. But I think it's a question of how we kind of manage our tribal instincts. And it seems to me that when things are going well, we're kind of okay, but then when they're not, we're not. The reason this worries me in particular is because I think it will affect Africans in the most negative ways, and even within Africa. It worries me that we don't know one another well enough. And so in South Africa, for example, when Nigerians and Zimbabweans and other Black Africans are being attacked, it's just really sad because I think it's a sort of thing that doesn't seem to make space for recognizing the history of, for example, Nigerians who were really up in arms against apartheid, and the ways in which African countries have connections and really should build on those connections. But I think in the next few years, we are all, as a world, going to go through very difficult years. I think that's inevitable. I mean, COVID has just completely changed things, and the economic recessions are coming. And it's going to be up to governments to figure out how best to guide people through them. And unfortunately for us in this continent, we don't seem to have leadership that is inspiring. And so it worries me about how well we're going to do.
So I think anybody who's read your books and listened to you would want me to ask this question. What are you working on now? I've been laughing on social media as people say, if you haven't finished your studies during the pandemic, you're not serious about life. If you haven't written that book, you're not serious about life. If you haven't managed to stick to your diet during the pandemic, you're not serious about life. So what has Chimamanda been busy with during the pandemic, and what can the world expect from you?
I've been busy watching a lot of things on Netflix, eating chocolate, ordering things online and returning them. I suddenly became really interested in strange things. I go on Etsy and I order earrings. So much as I would like to tell you that I've been reading Proust in the original French, sadly, I have not. And I'm not going to tell you what I'm working on because I'm a very superstitious Igbo woman. And I feel that if I talk about what I'm working on, I will jinx it.
Okay, I got something out of you. You are superstitious. I'll never forget that one. Thank you so much for chatting to me this day. But most importantly, congratulations on the Africa Freedom Prize 2020, being the recipient thereof. And we appreciate your contribution to global debates and a reflection on the self and identity. Congratulations once again, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ridi. It's always very, very inspiring for me to talk to a brilliant African sister, so thank you.
It's our pleasure now to perform a song that I had the great honor of being a part of in the year 2010. It's a song whose lyrics still have great relevance for our continent as a whole. It's time for Africa. You're a good soldier, choosing your battles. Pick yourself up, dust yourself off, get back in the saddle. You're right on the front line, and everyone's watching. We're getting closer, it's getting serious, this isn't over. The pressure's on, you feel it, but you've got it all. Believe it, if you get down, get up, oh, oh, when you get down, get up, eh, eh. Zamina, mina, zangalewa, this time for Africa. Zamina, mina, eh, eh, waka, waka, eh, eh. Zamina, mina, zangalewa, and now zamina, mina, eh, eh, waka, waka, eh, eh. Zamina, mina, zangalewa, this time for Africa. Listen to your God, this is our motto. Your time to shine, don't wait in line. If I'm much por todo, the people are raising their expectations. Go on and beat them, this is your moment, no hesitation. Today's your day, you feel it, you've paved the way. Believe it, if you get down, get up, oh, oh, when you get down, get up, eh. Zamina, mina, zangalewa, this time for Africa. Zamina, mina, eh, eh, waka, waka, eh, eh. Zamina, mina, zangalewa, and now, zamina, mina, eh, eh, waka, waka, eh, eh. Zamina, mina, zangalewa, this time for Africa. Abuela machoni, biggie, biggie, mama, 1, 2, seti, bati, salamachoni, biggie, biggie, mama, from east to west, bati, waka, waka, ma, eh, eh, waka, waka, ma, eh, eh. Song is easy, massive, yeah, 'cause this is Africa. Yeah. you, everybody.